Order, order. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this meeting of the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs Committee. Our evidence session this morning continues our inquiry into biosecurity at the border. We have a distinguished panel with us this morning. Just for the benefit of those following our proceedings and indeed for our own official record, can I invite you to introduce yourselves, to say who you are and what you do. I'll start on the right-hand side of the panel, my right-hand side, that is. Nigel.
Thank you very much, Chair. My name is Nigel Jenney. I'm the Chief Executive of the Fresh Produce Consortium. Our interests are fresh fruit and vegetables, cut flowers and plants.
Okay.
Good morning, Chairman. My name is Nichola Mallon. I am Head of Trade and Devolved Policy at Logistics UK. Logistics UK is the only trade association which represents all of logistics. So our members are the purchasers of freight services, but also the providers of freight services via road, rail, sea and air.
Good morning, Chair. My name is Sally Cullimore. I'm the Technical Policy Manager at the Horticultural Trades Association. The HTA has 1,200 members across the entire supply chain of the UK's environmental horticulture sector. We cover all 4 nations, and that includes garden centres, tree and plant growers, landscapers, garden goods manufacturers and service providers delivering for gardens and green spaces.
Okay.
Morning, I'm Katrina Walsh, the Strategy Director of the International Meat Trade Association. Our members include trading companies importing and exporting meat from the EU and rest of the world, as well as associate and affiliate members in the broader meat trading space, including agents and freight forwarders.
Thank you very much. And Sally, you've provided us this morning with a selection of photographs, images of trucks loaded with trees and plants, and images from the Harwich and Cullimore border control points. Thank you for that. We've seen quite a number of images from border control points, and these are by far the most palatable that we've had before us. If I can perhaps just, for the benefit of everybody, explain, a lot of what we are going to be asking today will inevitably look for a response from you all, because you represent quite a wide range of different sectors. Don't feel that if it has all been said that you have to say it again if that comes to that point. The purpose of having you here is that you get your say in, and that we hear the best evidence from you. But there is no compulsion if you feel that you're getting into repeating what others have said. So if I might just start off with a few questions around the vision for the UK border. In 2020, the then government stated that its vision was to have, and I quote, the world's most effective border by 2025. Looking at SPS controls, run quickly along the panel. How do you think that's gone?
So the aim to have the best border in the world by 2025, I think we couldn't say we'd achieve that given the impact of the border target operating model on importers from the EU, particularly SMEs, who have been hit by increased costs, damage to the groupage model in which they previously shared transport, and the failure to deliver cloning of certificates for import from the EU of medium risk animal products, as well as the failure to deliver electronic certification for rest of world imports. And the pausing of the single trade window, I think, is a step back from trying to achieve the best border in the world, because the more electronic that trade documentation can be, it has positive impacts in terms of reducing the potential for human error, as well as having sustainability elements. So I think we are still away from achieving that.
Yeah, it's a good illustration of how sometimes in politics rhetoric can come back to bite you when reality catches up, isn't it? Anybody have anything to add to that, Nigel?
If I could just add, and I would agree with my colleague, but I think the reality where we find ourselves today is we have built a world-leading border, but we've built a world-leading border that's the most expensive, least efficient and most inefficient in the world as we speak at the moment from my industry point of view, which is causing huge distress on industry, huge additional cost, which ultimately UK consumers have to fund. But it's self-imposed is the fundamental concern.
Yeah.
And if I could just add, Logistics UK was a signatory to the UK border strategy because we supported its ambition. but it hasn't delivered, and it hasn't delivered the world's most effective border, and there's still quite a long way to go. As the other panellists have said, there are significant costs and administrative burdens from the border target operating model, which disproportionately impact groupage operators from our industry and SMEs. And a lot of these difficulties are continuously dismissed, we feel, by government as teething problems. Well, for our industry, the physical inspections that were introduced from the 30th of April last year are hugely problematic. They are not teething problems, there are systemic and operational difficulties. And we have been working with Transport Logistics in the Netherlands and Transport Logistics France, which are our trade association partners, because we have a shared and mutual interest in trying to see these problems addressed. And that's why we have been putting forward practical industry-led solutions to DEFRA and to the Department of Business and Trade, given the impact on EU GB trade.
Mm-hmm. Annie, do you want to add anything on this? Yeah.
I agree with everything that everybody's said, but the horticultural trade has actually been subject to full SPS control since the 1st of January 2021. One of our members said the other day to me, Brexit has been here for a number of years. However, it didn't really start for us until the 30th of April last year. Mm-hmm. So the ambition for all of us is to balance the free flow of plants and trees with an appropriate level of biosecurity, but we find ourselves compromised on both, and that system works for no one. And our members are telling us that they feel out of control of their own supply chains, with previously well-cultivated relationships strained, and basically those relationships are in jeopardy. And it's the lottery that is the border. It's just not working for EU-sourced plants and trees.
Okay, well, I mean, you've kind of lent me towards what was going to be my next question anyway, and it was about the communication from DEFRA and the APHA with trade throughout this process. We've had how many goes at BTOM before we got here? Changes in policy. How has that impacted on your various sectors?
I think possibly, if I start for this minute, I think that my sector, from a fruit and vegetable point of view, is still not in the regulations, picking the point that we've talked about before. And in some respects, that's a relief from an EU trade point of view, but it's a huge concern because many of the questions we've been asking government for years have still not been answered. So we're still in the planning phase, but with no straight and direct answers. For those sectors that are in the regulations, such as cut flowers and plants within our sector, I think we've already alluded to the huge challenges and the huge additional costs. At the same time, the planning and discussion processes, I think broadly as an industry, we will feel desperately disappointed. We have proactively, from the beginning, offered far more effective solutions than those that have been adopted, at no cost to government, yet many of those have been simply ignored or rejected.
I'm getting a sense that nobody's feeling particularly listened to here. Look, it's your evidence, not mine. But tell me if I'm misunderstanding what you're telling me here.
I think they will have listened, they've not acted, they've ignored. Mm-hmm. Knowingly ignored, I would suggest as well.
I think the issue of communication and the lack of timely, detailed guidance from government has been a persistent problem through the BTOM experience. Mm-hmm. And it is often just far too little information, far too late. And you cannot turn off and on supply chains like they're water taps. So it hinders businesses' ability to plan and to prepare and to speak right throughout its supply chains to ensure that it's ready and compliant. The other problem is that there is ineffective communication between the agencies involved in the BTOM. So there is a difficulty in the communication levels from government to industry and also within government itself, across DEFRA, HMRC, but right throughout all of the agencies involved.
Yeah.
To come in on relation to the deadlines being pushed back, a lot of people put a lot of effort, both financially and time-wise, into preparing for the various deadlines. And then when they were pushed back, there was an element of preparation fatigue. That applies both to exporters in the EU and importers in the UK, where they were prepping for this and then it was pushed back. So by the time it was actually introduced, there was kind of an element of fatigue that people didn't really think it was going to be And when the border target operating model was actually published, it was in August when a lot of people were on holiday, which made it quite difficult for people to digest that 140-page document and respond appropriately. In terms of overall comms from DEFRA, I would say there was a lack of information quite close to when the changes actually came in. For instance, we only heard the level of the common user charge 27 days before, which was extremely short notice. There was also a lack of information about what the level of checks would be on rest of world. And after the implementation of the system, there were no 24-hour helpline staffed with experts that were able to answer questions from trade or give advice, which we thought was quite lacking. And then when there were many systems issues in relation to the computer systems going down or not functioning well, there was a lack of discussion to the trade to let them know that that was going on, but also a lack of comms intergovernmentally to figure out which system was causing the issue and what the solution was. So I think comms overall was lacking.
Yeah,
so there's it's two processes really. One is for businesses to enable them to have the right information to make pre-buying decisions about where they can get their plants and trees from in a biosecure manner that are compliant with the requirements that DEFRA have set out. And then there's at-border communications about what's happening in a practical manner. So, that lack of coordination and timely communication that everybody said is from all agencies. And it's really important that we get those, and they didn't happen.
And the lack of 24-hour access must be a problem from the logistics point of view, surely. We were in Dover last week and we were told there about the sort of round-the-clock operation of the port.
Yeah, I mean, transport is a 24/7 operation, and there are challenges in terms of communication. Drivers and the logistics provider are kept completely in the dark about which consignment on the trailer has been held, for how long it might be held, the reasons, and then that driver is often left sitting in facilities that are not fit for purpose or wouldn't be deemed to be acceptable by any of us. They don't have access to proper food or drink or restroom facilities. And what that also does is that is increasing the resistance, particularly among European hauliers, to come across into GB to service the market. So the ramifications of this are quite significant for trade, but also for the logistics industry in terms of recruitment, retention and resilience of that industry, which underpins GB-EU trade.
Mm-hmm. So the impact on your sectors, can I start with you this time, Katrina, and work your way along I'm thinking of the economic impact in terms of growth, and then we'll maybe come back and look at what you've actually had, how you've had to modify the way you do business afterwards. But I feel I'm being led towards growth in the first instance.
Yes, so the impact on the sector has been huge, particularly in terms of increased costs, increased delays to getting product in, as well as an increased administrative burden. The costs include the common user charge for companies importing through Sevington, Port Health Authority charges, having to pay agents and hauliers to pre-notify consignments coming in, to deal with the export health certificates, as well as having additional staff time to deal with any issues that arise during the import process, as well as paying the vet in the EU to produce the export health certificate. So there are a whole series of additional costs, but some of those costs disproportionately affect SMEs that are moving small consignments. SMEs are more likely to move smaller consignments compared to moving a whole truck worth of goods, and therefore the common user charge, which is a flat fee, and the 6-ton minimum PHA charge at Sevington disproportionately impacts those companies, because the cost per kilo of those charges works out a lot more if you're moving a small consignment versus a large one, and I think that hasn't really been sufficiently recognised, as well as the changes on the groupage model that I mentioned. That has really affected SMEs because they were more likely to use the groupage model, which is now very difficult to do given that there would be multiple export health certificates on one truck, and the risk of you moving your consignment and having done everything correctly but somebody else with goods on that truck hasn't, and then you get called to the BCP. So there have been a whole range of costs, and that has been really challenging for importers. Mm-hmm.
Anything to add to that? In terms of the growth implications for the year?
Around 80% of our members import some sort of plant material. 99% of that is from the EU. We import £780 million worth of plants and plant products per annum, and that was 2023 figure. And 90% of those businesses are SMEs, so the impact has been quite significant. One of our members is an agent handling SPS goods as a specialism, and they've paid for 400 trailers to be inspected at Felixstowe over the last year, £135,000, and that is just to unload and reload the trailers. So that's quite a significant figure. They are a small business, and that gets fed out to their
and actually,
customers.
the photographs that you've supplied for the committee today give us an indication of how that actually works in practical terms. The unloading, the reloading, it's a complex business.
It is. So not all trailers with plants on board are loaded in the manner of the photographs that you see, but we estimate about 25% of them are. So you do require specialist unloading and reloading equipment. You need to know what you're doing. We have experienced a lot of damages within the sector. The issue with that is that sometimes the damages are unseen, so it might not be physical damage, it might be temperature damage, for example, if you've got sensitive material that's been unloaded for an inspection and then reloaded. Now, I know the port operators, so these BCPs are operated by commercial entities. This isn't the Animal and Plant Health Agency unloading and reloading these materials. The temperature controls are ambient within the turnout areas, which is potentially an issue, and you may not see until weeks or months further down the line when it might be planted or it might be in a consumer's garden or a house, the impacts that you see. So that's the difficulty, is how do we know what to attribute to this? So yeah, it's certainly...
So should members then who end up actually picking up the cost at the end of the day in terms of quality of product?
Absolutely. So
the customers coming back demanding refund or whatever else?
Absolutely, yeah, definitely. And also when you have physical damage that you can see on tree trunks or whatever, often it's the haulier that ends up with the cost because no one wants to take responsibility for it. There's no customer charter from the border agencies that says, yes, we made that damage, we'll make that good. It's completely up to individual ports as to how they handle it.
We segue beautifully into the logistics angle of this. Nichola, you started the growth angle here. Anything to add to that?
Well, I would just press the point around groupage. So the groupage model is crucial for SMEs because that haulier is picking up multiple different loads for different customers and bringing it across, often of lower value and lower volume. So Katrina's absolutely right. That is the particular model that's being squeezed in all of this. It's increasingly not becoming viable for the movement of SPS goods. Most haulage companies operate on a tight profit margin of about 2.5%. Their ability to absorb the costs of all of the certs that are required and the checks is minimal. So to some degree there is inevitability of that being passed on to the GB consumer, and our industry is very conscious that consumers are already struggling with high food inflation. So that's the last thing that we want to see happening, but it is an inevitable consequence because the logistics industry can't continue to absorb it. There's the cost of the certs, there is the cost of the damage to goods when they're being offloaded and reloaded, and we would really like to see more training of BCP personnel. And we have also said as an industry we're happy for drivers to assist in the reloading so that we're reducing the risk of damage, but also enabling the vehicles to get moving in a much more efficient and timely manner. There is also the waiting times. Every hour a vehicle sits there, our members tell us that costs them about £55 to £60 alone for the hour for the vehicle sitting there, because you've got the driver's wages, you've got the knock-on implications then for the scheduling. So all of these are cumulative, and all of these are adding to the cost that hauliers and logistics providers are having to deal with, which is having implications for European and continental logistics providers increasingly saying it is not worth the time and the money of coming over and servicing the GB market.
I think just to probably try and summarise some of those points, for our industry in terms of fresh fruit, vegetables and cut flowers, the on-cost of the current border strategy is around about £200 million a year. It's huge. And when you look at the situations, we've talked about common user charge. I've given the panel information separately. But for every 100 consignments, a small SME, small family business, is being charged £14,500 to present a consignment for inspection. So it's charged for every single consignment, 100. Only 3 of those are inspected. So the CUC is almost £5,000 to present one consignment. If you go to a commercial facility, such as a control point, which our industry was asked to invest in, there's no government funding, it's businesses' hard-earned cash. Those facilities are being starved of work because of what, frankly, the industry would say is a monopoly of Shevington and the way it behaves, and not providing inspectors for out of hours for control points. So there is a huge on-cost to industry, huge concern about the quality of the goods that we can then offer UK consumers, and at the same time our ability to export has almost been removed. And ultimately our food security is a combination of domestic production, imports and exports. And just as a quick headline, we import 65% of all the fresh produce we consume and 80% of our flowers. So getting this right is fundamentally important for feeding the nation high quality food at a price they can afford.
Right, we're going to drill down a bit into the planning and delivery of BTOM and ask Sarah Dyke to lead the question here.
Thank you, Chair. Some of the features envisaged in the 2023 BTOM policy have not yet been delivered, as we've been hearing. But it includes the single trade window, the trusted trader schemes and the authorised operator status. But despite this, DEFRA's delivery team for the Biosecurity Borders and Trade Programme will shortly be disbanded or restructured. And in addition, in written evidence to the committee, the SPS working group says that there is a clear need for more policy officials, including in the veterinary facilitation team, as there's only a small pool of experts. What remaining elements of BTOM still need to be delivered, and does the government have the personnel and plan to deliver them? I don't mind who comes in on that one, Katrina.
Yes, I can start on that. So in relation to the trusted trader schemes, that has been quite frustrating because a lot of the elements of the BTOM that brought in those additional admin and cost burdens have rolled out, but some of the trade facilitative measures, such as the trusted trader schemes, haven't been. I think 2 of 3 of those have now been paused, so that has been rather frustrating to the industry. In terms of what you said, the SPS organisation mentioned, I would totally agree that the import teams and veterinary teams within DEFRA do need additional staff. Those teams are really great. There are very good people working there, but I think they just simply aren't great enough in number to deal with the many things that they cover within their scope. For instance, they're dealing with BTOM things, they're dealing with the animal health outbreaks in Europe, some rest of world things. So I think that would benefit from having additional staff in that team, because then they could look at some of the more growth facilitating things, such as delivering electronic certification for rest of world, which I believe at the moment they simply don't have the capacity to look at.
Just on that, what's the strategy to be able to implement more staff to be able to deliver these schemes properly?
I think DEFRA needs to make sure that there are enough policy experts within those teams. So I don't know if that's drawing from existing resource across government or hiring new people with that expertise in policy and veterinary areas. But I think that is a really key area where more staff does need to be in place.
Mm-hmm. Nigel, did you want to come in on that?
If I may, I'll take a slightly different position. I would say talk to the industry. We're talking about plant health, not other types of health. So the industry has that knowledge. It's willing to share that knowledge, and frankly has done for years. The fundamental is we've been ignored. I think the position is, as you mentioned about the staff moving on to other roles in government, one of the largest sectors that feeds our nation is yet to come into the regulations. We will import 3.5 million tonnes of fresh produce from Europe. We believe the regulations of fresh produce will apply from the 1st of January, 1st of July rather, but we don't know. We've had no official confirmation. We've had little communication for months now. So how do we prepare and how do we manage? And at the same time, as we've just already discussed, Groupage is fundamental to our industry. 65% of everything we purchase from Europe is on groupage for a combination of reasons. Many of our businesses are SMEs. Many of them are bringing smaller quantities to meet the shopping baskets of all of us as consumers. That's the important thing. And many of these things are highly perishable. At the same time, DEFRA will say to you, we've looked at the risk analysis and we've removed large amounts of these goods from controls totally, and many are low levels of inspection. But their estimation of the number of consignments coming from Europe in their recent consultation is 65,000. As an industry, we estimate 700,000. So unless someone wakes up and smells the coffee and control points are approved and authorised operator status facilities are rolled out rapidly, there is a crisis round the corner which will be managed by simply not inspecting the goods. But when you look at the level of failures or compliance by the industry, it is incredibly high. So we're investing huge amounts of money in many respects. For what purpose? When the industry, with appropriate controls, can do it itself.
And could I just add as well as the reclassification of fruit and veg, which is a huge concern for the logistics industry, because we would point to the operational difficulties that currently exist, and that's before you add on all of the volumes that Nigel has talked about. The other big issue is West Coast ports. And there still needs to be detail provided of how that will operate, when it will come into operation in terms of physical checks, and how it will interface with the Windsor framework as well. So that's another big area that's outstanding in respect of the border target operating model.
Thank you.
We were aghast, actually, that the biosecurity and borders teams were being disbanded and dispersed. Not least because, as Katrina says, we need those policy experts there that have followed us through since 2021. We are very concerned about resource at the border as well. We believe that BCPs are at capacity. Not that we've had any data to prove or disprove those sort of anecdotal gut feeling that we get from our members who are saying this all the time to us. And it is that data that is key. How are we progressing? Are BCPs working as they should be? We suspect not. So, yeah, aghast that things are being dispersed when we need those more.
Thank you.
Oh, and we are very worried, we're not worried about fruit and veg, but we are very worried that we haven't even reached the final beat on.
Yeah. And just going back to Nigel's point about the medium risk checks that are going to be introduced in July. Interesting to hear that you don't know yet, and we're just a few months away from that being implemented. So on that, how prepared do you think the industry is, or the fresh produce and logistics sectors are, for the introduction of these checks on fruit and vegetables come the changes in July?
Well, I think, as we've already discussed, the industry has been marched up the hill and marched down the hill on several occasions. So my industry mindset now is, I'm not doing anything until I absolutely get a guarantee it's happening. And particularly from trading with Europe, it's different to international trade with third countries such as South Africa. Many of that European trade is between SMEs who have not been involved in border processes before. So this is unique and it's new. And they've done nothing because they've got no confidence what will happen and when will it happen. And I think there's a real situation of all we need is clarity and a reasonable timescale to manage. But we also have to consider, with the volume of products that my industry is talking about, the government continues to tell me that my European partners at an official level have the capacity to provide the phytosanitary certificates. The trade does not believe they have, and I do not see how they can do hundreds of thousands of documents at that type of notice. The crazy thing is, remember, is that as an industry, these are highly perishable. We'll move goods in several hours. An official in Europe will check the goods. A few hours later, we'll look to do the same thing. what actual purpose in terms of risk is this actually doing other than managing a process? Mm-hmm. And I think there is a real situation when you look at, we shared separately, when we look at the volumes that as an industry we are importing and managing, when you look at our performance from a biosecurity point of view, it is exceptionally good. Yet, we are being told there's going to be huge additional plant health effort, fees and charges to inspect those consignments when the level of efficiency and performance compared with historical data is very, very low. From freedom of information, very briefly, in 2021 there were 103,000 consignments of fruit and vegetables coming to the UK from, not Europe, the rest of the world. 50% of those were physically inspected at the border, and there were 411 failures at the border. So in other words, we were almost 98% compliant. Move on 4 years with very limited information in the DEFRA fees and charges consultation. We envisaged there was 138,000 in 2024. The official inspection level is 5%, so it's only 7,000 consignments, not 50,000, and there are 121 inspectors to do that, and there are only 167 failures. So we now have a 99% compliant as an industry without any official management at all. Yet, the fees to our industry have gone from 4 million to nearly 11 million, and the efficiency of those inspectors, the average inspector 4 years ago was doing 1,295 inspections annually. On that recent data, they're doing 57. And if you look at a 70% average efficiency of an inspector, they could be doing over 2,000. So whilst we're not saying these inspections shouldn't take place, the level of performance and efficiency, and I accept many of these people are hard-working, diligent people, but there's a very different way to manage the process to get a much more effective result.
Yeah. So interesting on that, the phased implementation has been kind of bringing out some interesting information from the stats that you've just kind of told us about, which are quite stark. So it seems to me that data is key to this, and we're not necessarily getting this. Resource is key. Efficiency can be vastly improved, but we're talking about the timescale of being introduced in July. What's your view on whether this can realistically be implemented properly?
It's difficult to see how, because the truth is that the system is not operating efficiently and effectively as is. And that's before you add on the volumes. So if on average our members are telling us that they would have about a 4-hour wait on average, up to 8, sometimes 24 hours at a BCP. If you add in all of these volumes and that additional cost and delay, the economic consequences are significant. And that's in the face of the government's growth ambition, and as it's about to launch a trade strategy. So it is genuinely very concerning.
Given it's predominantly my sector that's yet to feel the pain, let's put it that way, but I sympathise with all the other sectors that are already enduring that, is that it is simply physically not possible. Even the categories that are within the regulations that our members manage currently, we know full well we're being charged CUC, we're being charged official inspection fees, but those inspections are not occurring. They're not occurring. We believe, given the stated inspection levels, whatever they may be per product, are simply not regularly occurring. So you have to begin to challenge, if this is so important, why are we not doing it? And this cannot be to keep saying we're supporting the industry during a transition period. That's not the case at all. We've been doing this for a considerable period of time now. It's about how the process is being managed by government and the resources they've chosen to apply.
How can the process be bettered?
In our view, look, from the beginning, we had a very succinct view, and we were very proactive, like many others, when the decision was made to leave the EU. It wasn't to build, in my view, an outdated 18th century solution for a 21st century business or industry. is that we had the opportunity and we offered to government that as an industry we would offer regional inspection facilities at no cost to anybody other than our industry, and official inspections could take place. That was outright rejected. We continued to encourage the commercial control point opportunity and fundamentally the assured trader position. So in other words, responsible businesses can carry out their own inspections and be audited and accredited appropriately. That is what we still want. That is what we believe is the most effective way of actually managing our biosecurity, minimising the costs to our industry and ultimately to consumers. And frankly, with what appears to be in the next few days an announcement from the government for a drive of efficiency in the civil service, we can provide a solution for you. We can manage these inspections with the suitable controls. It is really quite simple. And when you look at our performance level of success at the border, what is the justification for spending hundreds of millions of pounds? For what reason? When the industry is already doing it. We're not going to supply people goods that are inferior. Our customers don't accept it and won't accept it.
Are you suggesting there's a protocol in place that is just not being viewed as a mechanism?
Well, I think it's a deliberate policy by some aspects of government. If we talked about the late confirmation of the BTOM information and the late confirmation of the CUC fees. The CUC consultation was on a fundamentally different subject to how the fees are actually then applied. And then at the same time, we've got several members that have invested hundreds of thousands, if not millions of pounds, building control points to service our industry. At 2 weeks' notice, they were told, well, we're not going to service with official inspectors now those facilities beyond broadly normal working hours. As you will all appreciate, our industry works 24/7. This morning, as we speak now, our industry will be placing orders with Europe, which will arrive later this evening and through the night. The government's not providing any inspectors at control points to be able to service that. And they haven't got the resources, it would appear, to do so. It's forcing everything into Shevington and others. And you can see the stats change is that everybody is desperate to avoid using Shevington because of its cost and delays and its inefficiency. So at the moment we're moving to other port BCPs, but they simply don't have the capacity. The ferry services going to those locations are at capacity.
Yeah.
So the solutions have always been there. They've just been ignored, and we're now in a situation that we now have a self-made crisis, and as an industry, we need an urgent solution because, as we've discussed, from a haulier point of view, from a driver point of view, and our trading partners in Europe, enough is enough. I just don't want to keep absorbing all of these costs on an ongoing day-to-day basis. The impact on our teams and our staff and drivers is immense. No one would say to us is that, sorry today, as you arrived at Parliament, could you please wait outside for 6 hours? I might be able to get a glass of water, but nothing else. That's what we're doing. That is what, as a nation, we're doing on a daily basis to drivers.
If I could just say, I do agree with everything Nigel said. No one in government is actually tasked with making it work for traders. So DEFRA was tasked with delivering the BTOM for SPS goods regardless. So, that's why we've reached this. We're at business as usual. Let's disband the teams. We've only got one more element to deliver. All the BCPs are in place. And the plant trade said since BCPs were first proposed to handle EU goods, that they're not fit for plants. They won't work. But our solutions were rejected. So whether that's a control point solution, which works for some sectors, or whether it's what we're describing as a place of destination plus system, where you move things, and I'm talking about the trees that you see really on the pictures that I shared with you, where you move those products inland to the experts that have done the unloading for years. but they are under an enhanced or audited system that allows those checks to take place at those experts. What you will see is those experts are not experts in just unloading and reloading plants and trees. They are also biosecurity experts. They have a vested interest in being biosecure. So why not utilise that? Why not reward, get an earned recognition scheme going that actually rewards good biosecurity practices and enables those inspections to take place if we absolutely must have them. So I guess, on paper the BTOM looks robust, it looks biosecure, but as soon as you start to use it, it really becomes apparent there's big holes in the system, and all it does is add cost and stress. I mean, I cannot emphasise how stressed everybody is in certainly our sector, and from hearing from the other panellists today, it's a human cost.
And even when you put forward, which seem on the face of it to be quite simple solutions and improvements around, say, communication, they're not enacted. So, for example, as a haulier, you're trying to deal with multiple different agencies. We have been asking for a single liaison contact for industry where you put in your query, it's fielded to the appropriate authority, and you get a comprehensive and timely response back about what consignment's been held, why it's been held, and when you can expect it to be released. And you don't seem to make any progress on that, which then further frustrates industry in trying to be proactive and work with government to find solutions, which we're keen to do.
Yeah. What's your view on the impact on consumers from July?
Well, undoubtedly, new processes and new costs have to go somewhere in the system. And as I said, for logistics, it's operating under tight profit margins, so its ability to absorb additional costs, it's at breaking point. Our concern is that we will see an increase in higher prices on staples, people's diets. And of course that comes at a time when food inflation is already high. Logistics UK did ask the previous government, and we have asked this government, to publish the modelling behind the assertion that BTOM will impact food and drink inflation by 0.2% over 3 years. Because from our feedback from members, we would question that, but we haven't been able to make any progress in seeing the detail of that model and to truly understand the inflationary impact.
Okay. This is really compelling evidence, and I get a sense of an element of therapy in all this as well. But we do need to be mindful of time.
Thank you, Chair.
You done, Sarah? Charlie?
Yes, okay.
Charlie, did you want to come in?
Yeah, I'll come in briefly, thank you, Chair. Just on the engagement front, you've already mentioned the lack of engagement. I think there was, when the Windsor framework was put into place and the EU exit initially, there was, I think, a reasonable process. I was involved before I was elected, certainly on the Windsor framework side, regular calls every week with Cabinet Office facilitated meetings, all the officials on board, 400-500 people on those calls, able to ask all the questions needed. Are you saying there's none of that you're feeling at the moment? There's no engagement at that level at all?
There is engagement with DEFRA, but if I give you one example, we have an outstanding query in with DEFRA for 11 months now, asking for publication of when BTOM will be scaled up to its 100% of physical checks, and we still don't have that information. Now, we're not asking that information to be difficult. We're asking for that information because businesses need to plan and prepare, and it will bring a series of additional costs. So you do have a sense of frustration around that. DEFRA did very helpfully prepare a common problem document, if you like, which it would circulate with regularity, and it would alert traders to common problems and solutions. I think that has been effective. But trying to get timely responses on behalf of members asking real world issues with practical examples can be hugely challenging, as well as getting that timely, sufficiently detailed guidance and information from government.
And just very briefly on BCP specifically, there's a challenge. They are commercial operations. If you take them out, well, they should be commercial operations taken out of government control. Is the model that you've suggested, a regional model, actually viable for, to operate a number of BCPs on a commercial footing?
Absolutely. They're already BCPs are those that are at ports, and they are commercial operations at support.
Yeah.
Beyond that, as an industry, and several clearance agents have, what are the control points. So it's the same standard of operation, just a different official title. They have been used successfully for many, many years at major UK airports, and are currently available and could do a fantastic job. I've given within the evidence an example that where I said about, for a 3% inspection level, a CUC fee of around £14,500, a commercial control point would offer exactly the same service for £500 or less. There is huge inefficiency. The industry wants to step up and do what government wants. We just need the opportunity to do it and enough notice to be able to plan.
Thank you, Jeff.
Ian, did you want to come in?
Just very quickly, we went to Sevington last week and it seemed there was lots of facility there, so there were 40 routes to come in and lots of inspection chambers. Obviously, we don't know how many inspections are taking place completely. So I was wondering because you say you can be there for hours and hours and it's really difficult to get through. Is that, you were talking about the loading and loading being done by non-experts, and you were talking about hours of inspectors. Why do you think then that it's taking so long and the numbers are so low?
I think there's some issues around checks not being done concurrently. So a driver, if they have consignments that are subject to multiple checks, will have to wait a couple of hours for the first check, then have to wait for any subsequent check. One of the practical solutions that we have been saying is, can checks not be done concurrently to reduce that time? Our members advise us that not all bays and PCPs are often used, so you will have traffic there and not every available bay will be utilised. Our members have also reported that they feel that number of BCPs would not be sufficiently staffed, and we are concerned around the level of training because we do have instances where fragile goods have been damaged while being offloaded and reloaded.
I think move on then to questions by security. Helena, you need to
Thank you,
read the
Chair.
question.
My questions are focusing on biosecurity, but I'm conscious that some of this has been touched on in earlier questions, and we are short on time. I just wanted to pick up on a point that Jane was referencing, and I think, Sally, you were earlier talking about how there are holes in this system that are weak points for biosecurity. When we were at Sevington last week, one of the things we observed was that while there were lots of efforts being made to make it biosecure, there were also kind of holes in the floor, worn flooring, and that could be a potential issue for biosecurity. Is that something any of your trades have picked up on?
So, if I may. We're talking about BCP design here. So the blueprints for BCPs are actually relatively old, as far as I understand it. You'll have visited Sevington. You'll have seen that actually the bays are all within one turnout area. So that actually represents a biosecurity risk. Yeah. Because if you've got several loads all being unloaded at the same time, you're mixing those products, and potentially, mobile pests or disease can jump between the products, which is a massive issue. So that in itself actually curtails throughput of a BCP. For plants and trees, a lot of the time we will be using the drive-in bay. I don't know if you saw the drive-in bay. That's not even big enough to actually unload anything in. So currently the inspections are just done off a platform where you pull the curtains back and have a look. That's not an inspection really. That's better off being moved inland and unloaded at the experts. So the blueprint really was because it's been delivered for rest of world goods. Nigel mentioned BCPs and control points for rest of world goods at airports. But the problem was that consultation wasn't done with the sector. So therefore, we're stuck with a blueprint that doesn't really work for anybody and doesn't help with biosecurity. That's probably one of our main issues, is the physical design of a BCP is not conducive to what is a unique border with the EU. Nowhere else does stuff come across a border where there is no SPS agreement in place that comes across on ferries, on trailers. I can't think of another border that has that type of volume and just-in-time delivery and no agreement in place.
I think that I would agree with what Sally said. I think the concern is that if you're experiencing, let's say, quite poor levels of maintenance, the facility has cost hundreds of millions of pounds, enjoys £24 million of income every year, and yet is not being maintained adequately. That's pretty shocking as one of the payers of the services. But your point about biosecurity is absolutely valid. But when you look at, as I've mentioned, but my particular industry, the commitment to biosecurity and their performance is exceptional. So whilst controls should be in place, there are much more modern, much more innovative ways of monitoring and managing and maintaining our biosecurity that doesn't cause such disruption and cost that ultimately we all pay for as consumers. You know, it's only UK consumers that are going to pay this bill, and at the same time, it's almost impossible now for our industry to export fresh produce even to Europe. The delays are so long, I cannot take the opportunity to trade. And ultimately, as a sector, we want to grow more fresh produce in the UK. Yes, we'll always import fresh produce, but we'd love to export more. But it's fundamentally difficult when the border facilities that we can't control or manage are just not fit for purpose.
So if I could, biosecurity is not delivered by border controls. Biosecurity is delivered by the supply chain. So if you can have a supply chain where you are in control of that, when you have a vested interest in being biosecure, where you know who you're buying from, and I'm talking specifically with reference to trees and plants, and now our members are saying they feel out of control of that. The model that is in existence encourages consolidation, and that means at both ends of the border. So plants and trees are coming in and being mixed because it's quicker and easier. It's not necessarily cheaper, but it is quicker to actually deliver a phytosanitary certificate from consolidators rather than going around lots of different nurseries issuing phytos, and then you get into issues with groupage, etc. So, it's delivering an unbiosecure supply chain with no control for those traders.
Yes, on the topic of biosecurity, we don't see the import under the official BTOM regime from the EU as representing a threat or a lowering of the biosecurity in the UK, because for many years when the UK was an EU member state, we had free trade of goods without the need for export health certificates or import checks. So we think the UK is taking quite a risk-based approach on that. I think the real risk to biosecurity from our perspective is the illegal smuggling of meat that's taking place, because those goods, they're not declared, they're not subject to the right procedures. I doubt they're being transported in a hygienic or cold chain compliant way. So I think it's very important that there is sufficient funding at Dover and in the inland authorities to actually pick up those illegal goods that are being smuggled. And certainly for our members who are traders who are importing through the official BTOM regime and taking on all of the additional costs that we've talked about, it's extremely galling to them to see people illegally smuggling and undercutting them and putting the UK at a real public and animal health risk. So I think more needs to be done to tackle that side of biosecurity.
We are looking at that closely as a committee to see some of that happening last week in Dover. But I know we're looking at that very closely. Andrew?
Yeah, I think most of my questions have been picked up, but just a couple more things, and I should probably put on record that I used to represent animal and plant health inspectors in a previous life before being elected to this place. So could you just perhaps outline a bit more where you think the challenge on biosecurity is between capability and capacity? Because you've all talked about some of the facilities not being right, the training that inspectors have and others, that balance between the capability of the system and the people doing it and the capacity of the system.
So I will absolutely say that AFA inspectors are, for certainly the nursery trade, are often part of the business almost, because that's where you get your information from. That's where you can make a buying decision before you've even ordered your plants and trees. So AFA inspectors are actually very well respected. And previous to BCP operations, there was a lot of direct contact between businesses and inspectors, a lot of exchange of information, and we've lost that connection now because the
How has that connection been lost?
Because the inspections are happening at the BCP behind closed doors, and so you don't get that direct communication. Walk around the stock, have a look at it. Yes, field inspections still happen, but import inspections do not happen at place of destination, and that, I would say, is a very key element for our members. That lack of connection.
Anyone else?
I would agree. I would applaud the dedication and hard work of the individuals doing the inspections on a day-to-day basis. What we have is a system beyond them that is simply failing. They're hard-working, committed people, and I'm sure if we refocused how we manage the border strategy, they can be utilised. But again, as I think we've already highlighted, the industry, in conjunction with those individuals, has huge experience itself, and that should be used to greater effect. They should be auditing the industry, perhaps, and the industry using its knowledge, using those capable people in a different way to achieve the outcome.
I think it may have been Nichola, but it may have been someone else talked about issue at BCP in terms of training and numbers of staff. Is that in relation to biosecurity or just in the running of BCP?
From our perspective, it's in the running of the BCP, so we would identify it as a general issue that needs to be addressed.
Mm-hmm. And also bear in mind that an import inspection is a check on compliance. It's not a QC check. Mm-hmm. So, it's really important to hold that in mind.
I think the stats I highlighted earlier on reinforces the industry as being highly capable. This is a check, no more than that. I think the other point you raised, though, is that it is about that border process that the official inspector has. Yeah, when the goods are presented for inspection, they conduct those inspections. Is that the only service level agreement that I'm aware of is that they request it will be 4 hours from the goods being presented for inspection, not the vehicle unloading, the goods being inspected for inspection, 4 hours. When you look at the official consultation of fees and charges, after I've recently confirmed, it takes them physically 35 minutes to do that. So we are chasing around for hours, trying to get access to vehicles, so those vehicles and their drivers can deliver to our customers. It's failing badly.
Yeah. So, in your opinion, we have enough expertise to do the biosecurity checks within the system, or do you think we need more?
I can answer that one easily, is that with the volumes of goods that I've just suggested, there are not sufficient resources, and there never will be in a government process. You have to use the industry more effectively, which is why the solution we've always offered for 5 years now is about using control points, and then is about using the associated trader status, whatever terminology you want to use, and allowing those capable inspectors to audit and manage that relationship with those businesses. We have thousands of people working in our industry. There are 120 inspectors. We bring many, many more hands and legs to help us achieve the biosecurity that we want, but we have to be accredited to do so.
Yeah.
Certainly, and my final question, I suppose, in your opinion, are the risk ratings and inspection rates for different commodities appropriate, or would you like to see any changes?
So on rest of world imports, the UK took quite a risk-based pragmatic approach and categorised some meat as low risk, such as beef from New Zealand and lamb from Australia, and certain shelf-stable meat products. So those commodities from certain countries don't need to have export health certificates or routine checks, and that was based on an assessment taking place on the risk. And when you do that, that improves port flows because there are fewer checks taking place, and if you can reduce levels based on having the confidence and having the information to take a more risk-based approach, that actually frees up veterinary resource to target higher risk commodities. So I think that was quite a modern step forward that the UK took.
And we would think that a risk-based approach is appropriate. I suppose the point that we would make is around communication. And if there is to be any changes to risk ratings, that's all sufficiently communicated in a timely fashion to industry so that it can make the necessary changes. So I would just emphasise the communication point in that aspect.
I think if I could just add is that from a risk-based point of view, I totally agree. It's the correct way forward. I suppose I'm fortunate that I'm part of a sector that mostly are low levels of risk, medium or low. But when you look at medium, all of a sudden there are two categories for our industry now, A and B. A is a phytosanitary certificate and a potential level of inspection that may be 3 or 5%. Medium B is for certain European projects such as grapes and stone fruit. I'm required to get a certificate, a phytosanitary certificate. I do not have to declare the goods from an IPAS point of view, and there'll be no inspections. So why are we requesting official documentation that will probably cost the industry £250,000 when the UK government has no intention of checking the documents or regularly checking the goods? It's either in medium or it's low. We can't have a halfway house. It adds no value.
So plants and trees on the whole are in category A, so high risk. But the EU products risk profile has changed very little since pre-Brexit. We always had the ability to implement national measures when we were in the EU's plant health area, and we were actually a leading light in writing the EU's plant health legislation. And that was directly transposed into UK legislation. There is a biosecurity strategy written by DEFRA Plant Health, and the Chapter 3, I think, which is on the biosecure supply chain, that needs to be activated properly. So I know I keep coming back to a biosecure supply chain, but that is where you are delivering the mitigation of risk, which is basically what biosecurity is.
Brilliant. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Andrew. I'm going to move on now to foot and mouth disease controls. Tim, can you lead us on this?
Thank you, Chair. So a lot of us represent communities that still bear the scars of that foot and mouth outbreak so many years ago. It's a very important issue to us. Can you talk a little bit, and I suppose starting with Katrina and Nichola, about when that news came in from Germany about foot and mouth, how well the border systems operated in your view, and specifically if you have knowledge of it. We heard from other stakeholders in another session about IPAFs not being updated for 6 or 7 days. So over to you.
Yeah. So in relation to IPAFs, as a trade association, we wouldn't have access to that, so I wouldn't know any more than what the committee has already heard from previous witnesses. In relation to what happened when the outbreak was announced, I think the comms were relatively lacking in the early stages. We heard from DEFRA on the 10th of January that certificates couldn't be signed for unheat-treated meat of ungulates, but there was no information about what traders should do with products that were en route, or it didn't inform that they would be held at the BCP. And it was on the 14th of January that information was released saying that goods could be returned back to Germany, but it didn't take into account that they would have to go through France and there would have to be agreement of the veterinary authorities. And we did see a member try to return the goods, but they weren't able to enter them into France. So I think those goods ended up being destroyed, which obviously is a huge issue for food waste and sustainability and costs. Information on the cut-off date at which goods produced in Germany before the outbreak, if those goods were okay to come to the UK or what to do if they were already in the UK, that didn't come out until the 29th of January, which was quite a gap where people didn't know that information. There was one good example of comms, which was a webinar that DEFRA organised on the 16th of January, and that was a Q&A, and they had some really expert people from the import policy and veterinary teams, and they were able to answer some very complex questions that the trade had on that day. So that was a really good example of stakeholder engagement. And
that was by the 16th?
That was on the 16th of January.
Yeah.
So it did take a few days to organise. And I just think that underlines the point of needing resource in those teams, additional resource.
Really helpful, thank you.
There's not much that I would add to what Katrina has said. Responsiveness in respect of IPAFs and communication was slow. There has been an improvement, and you can see it as a continuum. So, for example, this morning communications was sent out confirming containment zones in Germany. So I think that it's important to take a step back and to reflect on the communications piece in this and to learn from it.
I'm just reflecting, Chair, that the webinar, which is the one good bit of comms that you've suggested the DEFRA did, was 6 days afterwards.
6 days after the
and we've heard the IPAFs were dated. It sounds like a light switched on just short of a week afterwards.
I mean, this is a new system. It needs to be pressure tested. Should we not be seeing this incident, this scare, as a pressure test and saying openly and transparently, here is where the steam came out the joints?
I think there was a feeling that there should have been comms that had been kind of pre-agreed in the event that an event such as this would happen, that would have been ready to roll out quicker. And unfortunately, that didn't seem to be the case. So I would say that it would be good for there to be risk assessments and readiness for comms in future events. And I think when the Hungarian outbreak was detected, there was much better communication and comms were coming out quicker and they were more detailed, probably because of having had the experience previously with Germany. And as the UK has regulatory autonomy now, it was able to take a countrywide ban on Germany, whereas within the EU it was regionalised to a particular zone. So the UK did have more time to do a risk assessment than it would have otherwise. It is fortunate now that the UK has recognised regionalisation in Germany because it is an important supplier of meat, but they did have a bit of extra time to make a risk assessment based on information provided by Germany, which we think is positive.
I don't know if there's anything else you want to say about the impact on importers or drivers. By the way, it sounds like a driver's life is really awful in the world that you're operating in. And if there isn't any other examples of an impact on importers or drivers, I don't know if there is.
In relation to the FMD?
Yeah.
So Germany was the biggest supplier of fresh pork to the UK last year. And we do also import beef, processed and prepared pork and sausages from there. So there has been an impact on availability, and we have seen beef prices currently are very high and supply is quite tight, which could be influenced by Germany not having been allowed to export for that period. But also there are other factors going on in the beef industry as well affecting prices.
I'll hand over to Jenney in that case.
Thank you, Tim. Just to pick up on Tim's point, and just to reiterate that in Suffolk as well, the legacy of foot and mouth is felt keenly. So I know there's a lot of nervousness about what we're seeing in Europe at the moment and here. Katrina, you just mentioned the Hungarian outbreak recently, and I wanted to just pick up on that in a bit more detail. How is that different in terms of the communications that you received from DEFRA? What worked better, and what would you encourage was kept and that we learnt from more as well? Sorry.
I think we saw more detailed information come out at a quicker stage, where in the case of the German case, we were waiting for detail for a bit longer. So that was good to see.
From days down to?
I wouldn't have the exact information on the dates that things came out, but from our impression, things were more detailed more quickly. We did actually submit a paper to DEFRA after the German incident outlining some of our concerns about the communications, and then we did see an improvement in the Hungarian case, but there would be less impact on the market because Hungary or Slovakia, which was also banned due to the proximity of the outbreak to the border, they're not huge exporters of meat to the UK. We do import some pork from Hungary, but much less than from Germany.
Okay. And would you do the same exercise again of writing to DEFRA with your feedback from the Hungarian outbreak? Because I think by the sounds of it, not to give you all the credit, but they may.
No, certainly
I think it's clearly valued, that feedback, and I'm sure there are still lessons to be learned from the most recent outbreak.
Yes, we would perhaps provide some feedback on it being a much better approach that was taken on the second instance, as we do like to be constructive and provide positive feedback where we see it's appropriate.
Would you be able to share that with us as a committee, the feedback from the Hungarian outbreak specifically? Because we've had in detail feedback from others as well about the Germany outbreak.
Yeah, I can check internally and provide something in writing perhaps.
Thank you. Sally, on more broader plant disease outbreaks, what's your assessment on some of the most recent responses to disease and plant outbreaks?
That's quite interesting actually, because we had a pest interception, cicada, back in September at Sevington. The communication around that was frankly appalling. We also fed back to AFA, because that would be AFA and DEFRA that would be doing the communications. And I must say I don't think anything has changed. So there's no set process about what happens. There is a set process, but the communication with traders, there is no process involved. So there's no automatic email when your consignment has been held. We suspect this pest. This is what you should do. And then to the wider trade about, we have intercepted this pest, it's a new pest, it's a pest of fruit trees, which is obviously could be quite impactful. They could have saved us hundreds of thousands of pounds by communicating the issue immediately and giving advice on where the pest was found. It was somewhere in Italy, what it is, why they're intercepting it, why they want to hold the consignment. But people didn't know about it, so they kept importing.
Yeah.
So, this is key information that is exactly what we want to know, because we don't want to import it. Thank you very much.
Yeah. You say you're attempting to feed that back, but you're not finding it easy to feed that back.
There was commitments from individuals that communications would improve, but what we didn't see is any official statement to say this is what will happen now. Okay. As a result of this, we've made these learnings, and we're hearing you as a trade about what you want to see in the future.
Yeah, that's interesting. Thank you. Nigel, anything from your perspective on that?
No, I would totally agree. There needs to be that effective and prompt communication from my sector. On occasions, things of this magnitude have not occurred. But where we do have issues on occasions where, let's say, an inspector has found a potential pest and they can't immediately identify it, it goes off to various AFA labs to be checked. On occasions, that communication timescale is extremely long, and the goods that we are importing have a very, very short shelf life. And on occasions, those decisions have been proved to be wrong, and that leads to tens of thousands of pounds worth of perfectly edible fresh produce being destroyed. So I think my point is slightly separate. Yeah. If decisions to hold are made, there needs to be a clear and effective decision about whether there is a notifiable pest or further action needs to take place, rather than just coming back in 2 weeks' time, because it's too late for my industry.
Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Jenny. It strikes me this is the point where the working relationship between yourselves, DEFRA, APA, actually really matters, isn't it? And the very detailed and graphic description you gave of that is not a good working relationship, good environment to start the operation in an acute episode like the FMD from either Germany or Hungary. Is that fair comment?
I think what I would say from an FPC point of view, I think probably like all of us, we're proud to have the relationships we have with those government departments. I wouldn't say we regularly disagree, that would be unfair. We share views, but we do need to find a constructive way forward to accept Rome is burning and it needs to be solved now, not 6 months from today.
You're not being listened to, though.
I think it is being listened. I think that in every relationship where the rubber hits the road is when it's tested. And from a logistics perspective, we support the government in its efforts to get an ambitious SPS agreement. It would resolve a lot of the difficulties on GB to EU trade. It would also resolve a lot of the difficulties on GB to NI trade. But in the interim, there are very practical things that we think can be done around communication, around the operation of BCPs in terms of effectiveness, capacity, training, that would make a huge difference to our industry. So we've come to that point now where we now need to see that materialise in and that change being realised.
Lovely, thank you. Jane, you're going to do the questioning on IT systems, please.
Yes, I was going to ask something about IT systems, if I can get my head around them. I'm struggling, to be honest. So maybe if I start with the driver notification system, because I know that do drivers now, there was at one stage meant to be an app, wasn't there? But that hasn't happened. So how are drivers notified? It seems that iPaths, there's a pre-notification, but it may go to the importer. So do the drivers automatically get a text message? Is that how it works? How is that
so drivers can be notified through a thing called GVMS. Okay, so there's a system. The challenge is that the level of detail is insufficient. So the driver knows that he or she needs to present at a BCP, but they have no idea which load in the back of the lorry is being held, for what reason and for how long. In the origin of BTOM, there was discussions with government about the development of a driver notification app, and we think that would be really helpful because it would enable the driver to be very quickly notified and to have the level of detail that he or she needs. We are aware of some examples where a driver has delivered the product to the customer and then receives notification to present. We are also aware of a case where a trailer of ice cream was held at a BCP for over 4 weeks. Now, if you think about the amount of energy that's required to keep that product refrigerated, that is a huge cost, and it took 4 weeks to resolve before it was released. In that case, it seemed to be that it was the challenge of trying to get to speak to the right person with the right level of seniority within the authorities to get the situation resolved. So on the issue of communication, I cannot stress this enough. Whether it is the level of information provided to the driver or the logistics provider and the importer, it needs to dramatically improve. And the data burden on traders and hauliers is immense. So there's a number of government systems involved in the border target operating model. Some talk to each other, others don't. So traders and hauliers are having to put in on multiple occasions the same level of data. And Logistics UK was disappointed when the government said it was pausing development of the single trade window for financial constraints, because it was one of the gains in the face of so much pain of the border target operating model. And if we are involved in discussions with Cabinet Office about the next steps around that, and if the single trade window in its full glory can't be progressed, government must prioritise reducing the data burden on traders. It has to be a priority. And we would argue, if you look at CDS, which is a customs system, our members say that that contains about 80% of the data that different government agencies need. Can that be used as a master data set in the interim? So government the agency pulls off what it needs, and the trader supplies the outstanding pieces of information. But certainly this is an issue that has to be addressed.
That was going to be my next question, actually, about the single trade window. Does anybody else can tell us about the impact, I suppose, of not having that?
I think I would totally agree with what's just been said. I think the aspiration to move to there in, let's say, coming years is fantastic, but we have to resolve the issues with the current system and make them fit for purpose. Simply not being able to tell 3 or 4 key contacts that a vehicle has been held and all the other customers that are on that same vehicle but don't know why their goods haven't arrived is ludicrous in today's generation. You know, it comes back to my 70% groupage, 200,000 vehicles a year from my industry coming from Europe. Each one of those vehicles will have 10 to 20 consignments on, so potentially 20 different customers. How do we know which ones are stopped? Because you have to give some very bad news to the other 19 customers that they're nights trading. Remember, the wholesale markets and the food service businesses that we all enjoy work through the night. So when that vehicle doesn't arrive, they've got nothing to sell that night.
This would change that. Katrina, did you have something to say too?
Yes, we'd really like to see the single trade window work be unpaused. A lot of the work that had been done up to that point was in relation to the customs aspect, but the SBS aspect is actually extremely burdensome. So having a single point to enter the information only once and not have a duplication would really benefit traders and reduce the possibility of things like human error on those systems. I think in relation to systems, we've seen a huge number of issues across the systems, including ALVS, which links the customs and phytosanitary and sanitary aspects, just went down over a weekend. So loads of trucks and containers were just stuck at port, and there was a real lack of communication about what was going on or how to get those released. And I think there was insufficient testing of the systems and how they would work together before this was rolled out. So I think we really need a complete review of the system's interoperability to look at IPAFs, AVLS, GVMS and CDS and the ferry light system and see how they're all working and how they could work better together, as well as having better intergovernmental discussions on which systems are causing which issues and how to resolve those. So I think there is a piece that could be done even before the single trade window is unpaused.
We've heard that there are sort of bugs and outages that are really impacting those systems. So you're finding that as well, are you?
Yeah. If there was a publicly available dashboard that industry could see in real time what government systems were up and running and what was down, that would be hugely beneficial as well for planning.
Right. Last question quickly about Todcoff. So allowing medium risk products to come in without any checks, and this is done apparently in exceptional circumstances. Do you know, have you got any evidence, do you know when that's been used so far?
It's not very transparent on when that's being used, but I think its existence suggests that there isn't sufficient resourcing of BCPs perhaps to do all of the checks. So I think it's important that they're sufficiently staffed, including with veterinary resource. But what I would say is that if there are instances where the checks aren't taking place, it would be extremely unfair if the traders are still being charged for those particular checks.
Absolutely.
So interestingly, the plant sector doesn't actually utilise Todcoff.
No,
it has
products only.
Yes, so it has a different system. So the Common Health Entry document, the CHED-PP, that's already immediately decided on. So, you know, because the risk engine is so complex that, and we import so many species, that the data and the manipulation of that behind that means that Todcoff actually, it's a sort of Todcoff, but it's not Todcoff.
Okay.
So again, we're introducing all of these complex systems.
The answer really is nobody really knows.
Nobody
when
really
Todcoff
knows.
at all. It may have been, it may not have been, but we don't know.
I think what we do know is that from an industry feedback, the level of inspections that we envisaged on occasion do not occur. Yeah. What the absolute reason is a mystery, let's put it that way.
Thank you.
Josh, you wanted to come in.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to briefly come in on Todcoff, because it's one of the things we discussed when we went to Sevington last week. The impression that we got was certainly that they couldn't tell us to what extent Todcoff was being used, but anecdotally we've heard that it's being used quite routinely to keep movement flowing through Sevington, because clearly they can't handle the number of checks that are being requested. Appreciate that you don't have those figures either, but are you getting a sense from your members that Todcoff or the Todcoff-esque check is that becoming a major frustration because they're essentially being pulled up to Sevington for no good reason, and potentially you've got, you know, goods wastage there, you know, certainly the supply chain's interrupted?
What we see is that we pre-notify and you'll get selected for a check. That's great. The communications then work with the driver because they're still en route, still on the ferry, and the trader and the importer and the agent can then communicate with the driver. However, then there's a manual intervention where the inspector who's in charge of the examination facility will then look at capacity within the BCP and look at staff resourcing and say, actually, I can't do that. And then release the goods. So then you have to go through that whole communication process again. However, someone has to be sat there looking at iPaths to see whether it's been released or not. And you can imagine ferries come in at all times of the day or night. So our non-Todcoff still releases things when capacity is reached, but the communication then is difficult, and that's when you get things stopping at the border, not stopping at the border. You know, the whole system is built to sort of almost generate disinformation.
Yeah. Our members do report that it is being triggered. I can't say with any accuracy the degree and the frequency of that. But in addition to what Sally has said, when it is enacted, when it's not clear what the triggering criteria is, what it just does, it just adds further to the unpredictability and the confusion around everything.
And would the development of an app potentially solve that? Would that be something that could potentially be added into that?
I think the benefits of an app stand on their own. I think what we need to understand is what is the criteria for the triggering of Todcoff? How does it balance the free-flowing movement with biosecurity measures? The difficulty with this one from our perspective is that there's just not enough information for you to take an informed opinion on it.
I think if I could add is that that's about a particular decision to release because of challenges at the BCP or whatever. But if my consignment has been selected for inspection, just simple communication of when is it likely my vehicle is going to be available for ongoing movement, we simply don't know. You know, ferry arrives at 5 o'clock this morning. We'll have had several of our clearance agents ringing, emailing constantly for hours, which is a pointless waste of time because we're just trying to find out when will I get access to that vehicle to service my customer. And that the AFA in Shevington or wherever, they're doing exactly the same thing. It is pointless. There needs to be an effective communication to say it's at this stage of the process It will be this timescale before it's available. But it's a black hole, if I want to put it frankly.
Yeah.
I mean, if DPD can tell me where my Amazon delivery is or whatever, you wouldn't have thought it would be beyond the wit of government.
But perhaps we're in this situation, as I mentioned a few minutes ago. The current SLAs are for 4 hours, and that's far, far too long for our industry. That's lost me a working day.
And in fairness, you wouldn't want your delivery on your neighbour's doorstep. Shall we move on, Henry, to the cost and supply chain implications?
Yes, I'm conscious that we've covered a lot of this already, particularly around the so talking about the financial implications of the BTOM, the impact on particularly on small and medium-sized businesses, and we've also discussed how that financial burden could be reduced while maintaining the biosecurity. The thing that I wanted to ask, though, Nichola, was in terms of any changes in the behaviour from EU exporters supplying the UK market.
Yeah. So as I think I said, we in Logistics UK work very closely with Transport and Logistics Netherlands and Transport Logistics France on the issue particularly of the border target operating model. We know from speaking to our members and speaking with their members that there are European suppliers who have taken the decision to withdraw from the GB market. We also know that continental logistics providers are also choosing to opt out of servicing the GB market, and it is becoming increasingly difficult to get drivers from Europe who are willing to come across into GB, and that's for all of the reasons that was spoken about. They have to encounter the delays, they require additional training when they're moving the SPS goods across into GB, and the unacceptable lack of driver welfare facilities, not just at the BCPs, but also like right across the UK, because it's in stark contrast to the facilities that are available for drivers in continental Europe. So we definitely are seeing that withdrawal, and it is becoming increasingly difficult for operators who for them, the majority of their businesses is serving GB. Just last week, I spoke with a large transport operator in the Netherlands. The majority of his business is moving plant and freshly cut flowers across into GB, and he is under immense pressure. His business model is under immense pressure with the cost implications and the stress of all of it.
I would add to that we have heard from many quarters that certain companies in the EU are just seeing the UK as being harder to do business with, and it being more of a hassle, because if they want to sell meat to the UK, they have to pay a vet to produce an export health certificate, and then there are all the uncertainties about when the product's actually going to be delivered, if there are going to be delays, and it's particularly risky for things like chilled poultry meat, which have a short shelf life. If you lose a day of shelf life, that has huge knock-on impacts and cost down the chain, so it is less attractive perhaps to sell to the UK than to just sell within the EU market. So that is a concern, obviously, for UK food security.
Could I just also add that in October, we're due to see the rollout of the EU entry and exit system at the UK's juxtaposed borders, which is the Short Straits, which is a critical supply chain corridor for fresh food and perishable products. At peak passenger periods, there will be significant knock-on implications for outbound freight, and all of that just paints GB as a very negative picture in terms of EU suppliers and EU logistics operators.
I think, turning around another way, we would want the UK to be seen to be as a destination of choice, but we've made it, as we've already explained, I think, so much harder. That is backtracking materially. Other aspects that we're seeing is that our long-term European partners are changing their terms and conditions of trade. I'm no longer prepared to accept the cost of the delays, the cost of damage, therefore the commercial terms change, so the UK importer is having to take that liability, which is not sustainable either. And ultimately, there's two choices. We'll have less choice, we'll have fewer suppliers, and it will be more expensive.
I'll leave you with one sentence that one of our EU-based hauliers said to me the other day. And he said, they're killing our sector. It's increasing prices. It's impacting all my customers. You are the laughingstock of Europe.
Thank you.
Sobering. Josh, Operation and Border Control Posts and Control
Posts. I think we've talked about BCPs quite a lot already, and it's clear from your answers that your members haven't had positive experiences of attending BCPs for SPS checks. So can I just ask you specifically, are you confident that BCPs and control points have got the capacity to deliver the number of checks that have been set out in BTOM?
One of the things that causes pressure on the BCPs is when there are systems issues that result in lots of consignments being called there despite not actually having been called for an inspection by the PHA, but because there are issues in the system, the default situation is that that consignment then has to go, and that's what creates huge queues there that are difficult to manage. So I think if the systems work better, there would be less pressure on BCPs when those incidents occur.
I think if I could just add is that I don't have that confidence for the explanation I've just mentioned about fresh fruit and vegetables. As an industry, we believe the number of consignments that could be selected for checks is far, far greater than AFA's assumptions. Therefore, those alternative solutions must be in place urgently. Otherwise, we're going to have to go for a delay, because taking whatever terminology you want to use, there will not be the resources to inspect the goods. That's a fact.
And on the BCPs, we have focused a lot of our attention on trying to put forward operational improvements that would make a big difference. And we've spoken about capacity, utilising all of the bays for inspections, enhancing training so that we're minimising any damage. There's also an issue around the opening hours of some BCPs where your load is landing, DEFRA aren't there, you have to wait a couple of hours. So there's issues around the streamlining and opening, and then the issue around, is it possible to safely carry out concurrently some checks? So, focusing a lot of our energy on how we can make that inspection process much more effective and much more efficient.
When we visited Dover, obviously more than half of our trade is coming through the short straits. One of the things that they were keen to mention to us was the lack of operation at Bastion Point, which was obviously commissioned at a cost of £22 million, as it never actually operated. And we went up and saw Bastion Point, and we were told by the Port Health Authority in Dover that if that was open, it would increase capacity, but it would also enable a lot of things that can't happen at Dover at the moment, like load splitting, which we've been talking about. If grouping is a common thing in the sector, then load splitting would obviously enable the goods that don't need to be checked to move on quickly, and then the others to be processed appropriately. Have you got any thoughts on that? Would Bastion Point being operational make a difference here, or do you think it's more about resources, other ports we've got?
I think specifically for my industry is that BCPs currently don't offer the removal of that consignment as part of groupage for inspection. Control points do and have done for years. So again, I think it's about using the best solution, which in many respects as an industry, we would much prefer to use a control point or something similar that gives you that flexibility but gives you that control. And we do have to be very aware is that if we're going to open another facility, that will be a government managed facility, and they already don't have enough resources. So my suggestion is be bolder, use control points or similar, and allow the industry to self-regulate with appropriate controls. That is the only solution that is now left if those levels of controls are required for, let's say, goods that are perhaps in the medium risk category.
And I think there's also a need for transparency in the operation of Sevington, and I'm thinking of the common user charge. That is very clearly a not-for-profit policy, and the charge was to cover the operating costs. Our members are asking questions around how efficiently Sevington has run, and then the impact on the charges that they are subsequently paying. So we've been asking government for some time, in the interest of transparency, to publish more detail around the operational costs for running Sevington.
Yeah, I think Sevington is full cost recovery, but the commercial rate to offer the same service is a fraction. So it may well be that it's covering its costs, but it's just not competitive either. So it has to be not just covering its cost, it has to be a least cost solution, and it's far, far from that.
Just touching on staffing, that seems to be a real core issue around the capacity question. We know that Dover Port Health Authority, for example, have only got the ability to do 20% coverage. So obviously most of the time goods are going through unchecked. What are your thoughts really on that? Do you think that there's potential for that resourcing issue to be resolved, or are we really looking at that's kind of going to be business as usual and we're going to have to find ways around that lack of staffing resource?
Is that AFA staffing or Port Health Authority?
Well, the 20% is Dover Port Health Authority, but clearly there's challenges on the AFA side as well.
I think if that is resourcing that's being used to target illegal meat being smuggled to the UK, then certainly that needs to be properly funded so that they can do a sufficient number of random checks to make sure that product like that isn't coming in. So I think there does need to be proper funding for those kind of checks that have a biosecurity implication, as well as for the inland authorities that also pick up things like that.
I think what I would say is that at the moment we're talking about responsible businesses making the appropriate declarations and incurring all the cost challenges that we've talked about. That's one thing. So we are penalising hugely responsible, hard-working businesses, yet we appear not to be resourcing areas to ensure that irresponsible businesses that are either misdeclaring or not declaring are getting away scot-free. So perhaps we put the resources in the wrong place with the wrong focus.
Yeah, that's something that we certainly heard last week. And we also talked about the fact that when a non-compliant load is found, often it's not cleared. There's a sort of voluntary declaration made, a surrender of the goods, and then the driver kind of goes off and oftentimes, I suppose, goes back and gets more and sees if they can get through again. So I totally accept that point. One of the things that we've also heard about is as BTOM is ramped up, that could be done differently at different ports, and so that could leave inconsistency in how checks are being done. And therefore, if you are a bad actor, you would go to the port of least resistance to try and increase your chances of avoiding that. Is that a concern for your members? Is that something that you're hearing?
Definitely the issue of a lack of consistency is a concern for our members. I mean, we have one member, just for one example, who has the same EU supplier, it's the same haulier, same GB customer and the same product. On one day he had 20 truck stops, on the next day he had 70 truck stops. So there doesn't seem to be a coherence in terms of the approach. So that is something that we would like to see addressed.
That's definitely our experience, where if you get resistance at one port, you see it skewed and they go to another port because it's easier to get through. So we'd like to see a consistency of operation across all ports so that basically you know what you're going to get, and then that resolves the issue of skewing trade and sort of encouraging active avoidance.
Interesting to hear there's that much variance, because obviously we're being told that it's a risk-based system, and so you'd expect that the numbers being stopped would be fairly consistent one day to the next. The risk isn't going to increase that much, right? The sort of content of what is being imported into the country isn't changing that radically overnight. Do you kind of have any sense of why that's happening? Why the system we've got is kind of being implemented so sporadically?
I don't think the variance is because of risk. The variance is because of capacity.
So it's a sense of, if we don't have the capacity, we're kind of reducing the amount of checks we're doing, and that's just a sort of natural consequence of that resourcing issue. If
you do the maths at Harwich, for example, where most plant trade does actually come through, they've got a different way of operating that commercial port operator has. It's probably quick. It might be quicker than another one, or maybe they've got a resource issue and it suddenly becomes slower, and that skews trade somewhere else. So it is resourcing and physical capacity, as we've already spoken to about the designation process of designing and building a BCP that constricts it automatically.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I think the other questions we had have kind of already been covered in the discussion.
Some of this, probably also to some of the compliance stuff, Henry, but you want to
although just quickly building on that point about consistency, we're talking about port health authorities. In terms of rules and guidance, do you see there's a consistency of interpretation of those in respect of DEFRA and the APHA?
Early on in the process, we did see some instances where PHAs in the UK had different views on how certain export health certificates from the EU should be filled out. But I think because that's a policy issue, it's actually up to DEFRA to give a clear steer on the interpretation. And therefore, in those instances, what we really needed to see was more direct communication from DEFRA to the EU authorities in the member states, their kind of veterinary authorities, but also directly with the EU if it was relevant. So I think the DEFRA to EU communication is very important in order to have that consistency flowing down to the PHAs.
We've got some information here about that some, in terms of APHA, some staff are like more flexible than others, and sometimes there's sort of surprise and additional testing. Is that something that you recognise? Or I don't know who to ask this to, but as a sort of broad...
I think if I could say is that there is always that, should we say, unique approach by some individuals, for example, but there does need to be that level of consistency. When you mentioned about Port Health, for example, which is an agency that my sector would come into contact with if it was checking for food safety, which I know broadly is beyond what we're talking about today, there does need to be a level of consistency because the fees and charges are enormous depending on which port you go to, and also the approach that consignments are just being taken on a weekly basis when it was the same supplier the week before, week in, week out. You get the same result, but it's just spent another £1,000. There has to be a more dynamic approach to managing that risk for the benefit of consumers.
Thank you. And there's just moving on. We've talked a lot about Sevington, and Josh talked about Bastion Point as well. The 22-mile journey. I just wondered whether you can comment on, in terms of concerns about non-attendance and potential risks involved in that.
Mm-hmm. I think that from my point of view, we've already suggested an alternative solution for managing inspections at the border. We see no reason why control points or the location can't be beyond the immediate sea boundary. But remember, that is responsible businesses that are declaring and managing their businesses appropriately. The government has to have another solution that is for those that just choose to ignore the regulations. We are hugely penalising an industry that is diligent, trying to do the right thing, and allowing those that simply want to just buck the system a free-for-all for doing what they want when they want. I mean, for example, we mentioned about ports taking, or not ports, but let's say different locations of entry taking things in a different way. There's a consultation by DEFRA recently just closed that suggested about a further easement of inspections at West Coast ports. So if I'm that irresponsible business, which port am I going to go to?
All I would add is just that obviously our members are robust in their approach to biosecurity and compliance, but understandably questions are being asked about a 22-mile trip between the point of entry and Sevington and how that can be utilised by bad actors in the supply chain.
I think if people are intentionally circumventing the system by not attending, there needs to be an element of enforcement to pick that up, because that's creating an unlevel playing field for the companies that actually are working really hard to comply. If there are instances where IT systems fail to adequately inform importers or drivers that they are supposed to attend, then I think if that's an IT system caused by a government system failure, then there needs to be a pragmatic approach towards the importer that was trying to do the right thing, but the systems failed in that instance.
Thank you.
Okay, and finally, we're going to come to the questions around the UK-EU reset. Sarah, you've been a model of patience.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Chair. So yes, there is going to be this EU-UK sort of reset, as they're talking about, coming up in the future. And it sounds as though, from what you've been saying, your sectors might welcome some form of SPS agreement. But is there anything in that sort of agreement that you'd be concerned on, if that's the case?
So on the SPS agreement, we're very much in favour of that if it reduces the barriers we're seeing on both import and export with the EU. If it were a very high-level agreement that only just reduced checks but still required export health certificates, that is quite similar to the BTOM regime and therefore would be potentially more limited in how helpful it would be. if it were a much deeper agreement that made the requirement for export health certificates and checks redundant, that would be reducing a lot more barriers. But if that came at the expense of having dynamic alignment, where the UK essentially just follows all of the EU regulation, I think that's a risk, because we've developed quite a pragmatic import regime for rest of world imports. I've mentioned some of the positive changes that we've made, and if we were to have a rollback of that pragmatism, I think that would be quite a risk. And instances where, for instance, the UK was able to do a countrywide ban on Germany when the FMD happened, that was because the UK has that regulatory autonomy. So I think one of the risks, depending on the type of agreement, is if the UK just completely signs up to everything that the EU food and health regime has.
I think it's really, I think you've just said it, but I think it is about the devil is in the detail. What are the standards we're applying? It would be a retrograde step for certainly many of our non-European trading with the UK to go back to what may be an EU standard. But again, it's about that challenge of divergence, because a lot of our food arrives in Europe before it comes to the UK. So that is causing an issue now when we need certification and other things that is very difficult to get in Europe, but the UK government does require it from time to time.
Mm-hmm. And all I would add is that if we need to learn from the experience of the border target operating model and the Windsor framework, and that means we need to be cognizant of the intended and unintended consequences of agreement. So we understand that things have to be negotiated in confidence, but there needs to be road testing with industry as well, and that needs to be built into the system. Otherwise, we're going to continue to repeat the mistakes of the past. Mm-hmm.
Absolutely advocate for an SPS agreement that includes plant health, not utilising dynamic alignment, but utilising a mutual recognition of each other's plant health areas. As Nichola has said, any agreement needs road testing with sector first to make sure it is fit for purpose. And as Katrina said, we have to be very careful about what we wish for. And if those elements that are brought into any agreement don't work, then, unless we do something now, there'll actually be no sector left to benefit from an SPS agreement.
Yes. And then just finally, because obviously it would take quite a while potentially to agree for one of these sort of SPS agreements. So if I could just ask you, one thing that you would want to see improved now for SPS checks in your sectors, what would that be?
I'm going to bunch two together. Dramatic improvement in communications with industry and between government and agencies, and also much more effective running of the BCPs.
Single point of contact, single point of data entry.
I would say moving towards more electronic certification, including cloning for the EU, as well as having robust staff in those DEFRA teams to support that.
A bit more radical. Fundamental acceptance of control points and service them with inspectors beyond the hours, in addition to the authorised trader status. We have to move on. What's happening now is killing the industry, and we can't wait for an SPS agreement.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much indeed. Your repeated references to groupage triggers me a little bit. I have to say, I had never heard the term until the 5th of July 2021. You'll be aware that I represent Shetland, which is a one-third fishing-dependent community. I could have made it my specialist subject for Mastermind by the end of January 2021. And I am mildly conscious of the fact that the one sector we've not spoken about today is around fish. Nichola, I'm just wondering from the point of view of your members, obviously this is more of an export issue, but we do import some fish. Are you aware of any particular issues in relation to fish trading?
Not specifically to fish, but I suppose the same issues apply in terms of communication and effective and efficient processing. If you think about fish, you're having to move at high speeds there. If you don't, you have degradation of product, and that has consequences in terms of consumer choice, availability, but also pricing.
Yes, because it's a premium product that gets exported and imported, and the loss if you lose that time is quite dramatic. We'll maybe find another way of picking that up on another day. But listen, in the meantime, can I thank you very much for your attendance here. Your evidence has been absolutely invaluable. It is part of an ongoing inquiry. We will issue a report at some stage, and I can assure you on the basis of what you said today that the evidence you've given will very much form part of our consideration there. So thank you for your attendance. Thank you to colleagues for their input and their engagement. I will conclude the session at this point. Order.